Hello, Alison, and welcome to the Dublin Conversations. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me today, Andy. My name is Alison Goldsworthy. Most people call me Ali, unless I'm being naughty, which does still happen occasionally. I am the president of Accord and the co-author of Poles Apart. Accord is a consultancy which helps people understand, manage, and where appropriate, reduce conflict within the organisations and wider world. And Poles Apart looks at why is it that people are dividing and what can we do to try and help bring them together. I've also been and I'm an advisor to Stanford's Conflict and Polarisation Lab and used to be in a former life a senior political advisor and big mobiliser or troublemaker.
And those are very much issues which are at the heart of the Dublin Conversations and its efforts to create a new framework of thinking that enables society, the communications industry, to be more purposeful to tackle those issues of growing distrust, divisive tribalism, or not being able to come together to tackle the big challenges such as climate change and so on. So we're going to take you through a 5 steps process, and I really value your feedback and your critique, and from which we can collectively grow in terms of our wisdom and new ways of doing. So what we're suggesting at the 5 steps of Dublin is that the first stage is that the efforts say that define advertising or public relations were very much like the early astronomers who tried to create very elaborate explanations for the universe, but with the Earth at its centre. And what we're suggesting here is that actually, if advertising and public relations and communications exist, if they exist at all, they're part of a bigger universe, a universe where a critical dimension is that after human functions of breathing, eating, using your senses, the need to earn confidence of others in order to survive and collaborate and cooperate and so on is a critical thing. And at the heart of that is the need to earn confidence, not confidence so much in a self-confidence, self-belief sense, but more in a statistical sense of what you're doing aligning with the probability of it being perceived as a reality by yourself and others. And that confidence can manifest itself in your own understanding what you perceive to be real, confidence in yourself and your purpose, confidence in others, confidence others have in you, a zeitgeist confidence. And we're saying confidence is a critical known unknown. There's much more we need to learn. Yet critically, the ideas of purpose and purposefulness makes it easier to create confidence by being more coherent and compelling. Ali, I just want any thoughts there at all?
Oh gosh, I've got loads and loads of thoughts. So I think firstly, thank you for the conversation, because I think this is much needed, and particularly within the advertising and comms sector, like their role. And I suppose that this sort of leads back to it is your initial point is like maybe people should put themselves less at the center and things. You know, advertising and comms in particular is not a industry that rewards humbleness on the whole by people saying, oh no, I wasn't that critically important to it. No, it was really lots of other people. And part of that is down to the model of how business works, where you pitch and you win and sharing credit. You know, like it makes much more sense to claim as much credit as you can, and that rewards people internally, often in form of promotions, but also externally in terms of winning business. So I think it's really hard to re-engineer that. Like, how do that so people aren't rewarded in essence for that? And that's also, you know, it's important, it's worthwhile people getting credit for what they do, and most people naturally like to think, you know, that they think of the world in terms of how it relates to them, not how they relate to the world. And that's again very understandable, because that's sort of how you survive, what you do. Like, is something a threat to you or to not? You don't sit there and think, oh well, in the broader sense of the world, how does this go? And particularly if you're uncertain, you know, or if you lack confidence and certainty around things, then you're much more likely to rely on those processes. I suppose the other thing that sort of links to that is, you know, we like to tell stories and narratives. It helps us make sense of the world, particularly when we're being bombarded with information. And, you know, if the modern world's there for anything and the internet is there for anything, it's we don't suffer a lack of information any longer. We need to try and get help making sense of that information, which, you know, when people blame algorithms, actually what they're they're doing is trying to help you make sense of a huge overload of information, or they're making sense of it for you. But we naturally like to try and create stories to do that. And those stories will often involve there being a goodie and a baddie. So the example I tend to use, like, you know, what's engaging to us and what we're rewarded with is, you know, something like Star Wars, where literally there's a dark side and a good side. And, you know, that's part of the reason that Star Wars is so successful, is when we do that, and when you naturally tend to think of yourself as being on the good side, you know, even if you're a troublemaker. And that's how I used to define myself. I was making trouble for good and to do things with purpose, you know, and other people potentially could be bad. Once you start dealing it, like, it makes it hard for there to be a sense of grey. And so I think, whilst this is, you know, to bring it back to exactly where you're at, I think it's exactly where you want to try and end up, is to enable people to live in a bit more in the grey rather than in black and white. But it's tremendously hard to do that, and it's really hard to do that in an environment that is stressful. And I think part of that will be, how do you control the environment as well as how people behave? And that's what I'm really excited to see where you'll come on to with what you talk about next.
And then move on to the next stage then of how we connect, how we engage with people. And as I say, like any fundamental sort of rules we have there, I'll just move the slides on. Sorry, I'll just slide up here. Yeah, so 1, 2, 5 then. So we're suggesting, influenced by the work of Professor Daniel Kahneman, that if you need to connect with others, there's sort of 5 key tasks, 5 dimensions to engage with. Kahneman identified that we're emotionally driven animals, but these 5 rules of thumb, or heuristics, being known and noticed, liked, trusted, front of mind, being talked about, really sort of frame any communications engagement campaign, and therefore provide a structure, which I think, building upon the earlier point about the need to create a bigger picture. So the more you can engage in a broader sense, the more likely to be effective to engage with others. Any thoughts on this model at all, Alison?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting the way that you've got it displayed here, because I think of these often as a network, and some of the ones that used to be important have changed in, you know, in the way that the environment we're in now. So actually being known and being front of mind and being talked about, you can achieve that for all sorts of things that are not related to your purpose, right? And it's quite easy to achieve those. I'm sure at points we've all run campaigns that have done that, or have been deliberately provocative, and sometimes they're legitimate, you know, doing that kind of work. You know, I like to think times when I've done it, it has been, but maybe not. And, you know, that, to link it back to like sides of good and evil, that normally leads to some people being liked or some people being disliked. And then I think comes in whether people are trusted or not. You know, people have to earn trust. But once you start dividing, you know, you decide whether you trust someone or not, and whether you like them and whether they are similar to you. And that can just come very much from, you know, are they being talked about? Are they front of mind? And are they known? And I think I'd looked at sort of, I'd look at the hierarchy of how these things tend to happen on the ground, and like where there are less good and less good forms of behavior from advertising and comms, like what's going on, and also how do people measure these, like what are the measurements of success. So I know people tend to look at brand trust and brand trackers and things like that, but often there's, particularly with things like social, it can be like, you know, how many retweets have we got, how many people have we reached, what's the discussion topics that we're looking at, and all of those are actually underweighting the more important points about how you link to purpose, and overweighting things that, you know, can skew the balance between these things. And I think that's the point, is it's no longer like an even 5-pointed thing, like all of these things come together roughly evenly for it to happen. Like some of them can be much quicker and more influential than others. And I know Kahneman sort of acknowledges that when he's talking about it, but like that's a rapidly changing world, and one that for short-term gain can be extremely well leveraged by people in advertising and comms, and can lead to great reward for them. But in a bigger global environment, it's just not as useful. And I think that's one of the things people struggle about. And I suppose the other thing is, something's easy to measure, tends to be what matters, right? And trust is really hard to measure, and some of the other behaviors like purpose in general can be really hard to measure. And as a consequence, like people find it hard to do things, and those more nebulous measurements also tend to be the first thing that's cut in a recession. And that is probably what's coming now to quite, you know, like being in recession. There's probably certainly a global chilling that's about to happen, and that will be one of the big challenges for communicators, is how do they cope with that? How are they responding to that by what work they do and don't accept in the broadness of it?
So it's an interesting sort of image that come to my mind listening to those. Almost, if we see like this as a map, potential map for a horizontal level, like like almost like a spidergram of those different dimensions. And it struck me that what you suggested possibly there is a vertical dimension with maybe like, which could perhaps be a spectrum measuring degrees of purpose and purposefulness. So I just wonder whether that sort of might be a pertinent addition to the model here. So.
I'm finding that the first bit I find really easy to visualize. The second part I find slightly harder. So it's a bit tricky for me to give, like, I think without seeing it written down, I don't want to give you useless feedback. But I actually think thinking of this as a, like, you know, we've probably all seen those diagrams where like, how far out, how important is this to our purpose? What, and not just how important is it, how much of it have we been doing and how have we been spending our time to try and deliver on that, like against that. Would be quite interesting.
Yeah, can I come back, because I think there might be a further dimension in our models here to address that. So we're suggesting then that having identified like the scoping of what you need to do, then the next is how can you do it? And we're suggesting in evolution of it's called the PESO model to an opens model. And the critical thing is these are not channels but strategic choices to identify how you connect. And critically in the dimension of purpose is that own is not own channels, but also your own purpose, your own sense of purpose, your own clarity around that purpose, the stories around your purpose, the reputation that you bring as a purposeful being, plus then the dimensions of paid for, earned, nudge, and shared. And what the Dublin conversation is hoping for, that hopefully that could be a stimulus for a greater investment. And it goes back to Aristotle in terms of his sense of character. So just wondering there whether there's merit and potential and of a more focus and accentuated concentration on you know, getting your own house in order and being the best house you can be, as much as then like the traditional sort of we communicate by doing this, this, and this. And just wondering any sort of thoughts on that at all, Ali?
If I'm honest, I find it slightly hard to, like, I think every point that you said is very worthwhile, and I have a lot of time for it. There's a few bits that I'll come back to in a second that I'd add to it. I slightly struggle to see how it all fits together in this framework, and I worry slightly that actually you'll underweight how useful they can be, like the points you're making about your own purpose and how consistent are you with your own values. Where you have inconsistency, how do you cope with that? You know, like that deserves a lot, you know, and I mean own both in terms of a company and how it does that, you know, as well as individuals within that and leadership team. I think that's hard for me to see how it sits alongside like paid for. Like I think that would be one thing that I'd look at, and particularly alongside like nudges and shared things. The other point that but they're all like, there's nothing wrong with any of this. It's just how that you build the house around them that I'm slightly confused by, I suppose. But the other thing that I'd add to this is the role of messengers, right? Once society becomes increasingly divided, and that's definitely, you know, part of how we started talking, that the messengers become as important as the message, or as important as the channel that people are using and who they trust. And I think that's something that people use. And you can see it sometimes, like companies get it really wrong when they'll use chief execs to make an announcement about something because they think it needs the most important sort of senior person in the room, but actually that's not who listen to what's going on, you know. And you know, we probably all had to advise some chief exec wearing some $5,000 Rolex or something that probably will undermine their message, and they'll be the wrong messenger if they do, you know, like even really simple things along those lines can be really important. If I think back to, you know, when I did organ donation campaigning in Wales, the most powerful voices there were people who were waiting for an organ. It was not us running the campaign. Like they were by far the most effective people to put up to talk about things, because people could identify with them much better.
Again, very important, like own the authenticity of voice. And then really step 4, we're saying about the power of emergence, and a very simple message of a model here of listen, connect, do, of how you listen to what emerges and purpose at the centre provides a sort of vital dynamo for a more dynamic listening, connect, doing. And Dublin Conversation believes there's a need for a label to explain the bigger universe. And there's one potential candidate of the word comms, and we're suggesting there comms can be defined as how you create confidence within yourself and others to exist, coexist, cooperate, or collaborate by managing perceptions around your future behaviours. And then significantly, which I think may feed into your earlier point there about how measuring or potential measures of purpose, is these ideas of we-led thinking, where 2 out of 3 people will apparently help a stranger, where your instinct is to think of the global collective good first, and me-led thinking, which is much more self-centered. I just wonder, say, mindful of your time, any sort of key thoughts here at all, Ali?
So I think 2 things I pick up from that is, you know, some people are me-led and some people are we-led, but what's the environment that, like, they're not always consistently, you know, and all of us can probably think of times when we've been a bit more selfish or helped it more, like when we've helped people, and we always really help people, you know, and what's going on when that's the case, like, you know, and I think that would be like what can you do to try and help trigger people to be more we-led than me-led, or to deal with things that will make it harder. The other thing looking at this diagram is, like, I think it's really helpful that you've got the feedback loops and the reflection in there, but what about how effective is that feedback and people's ability to reflect on themselves? Who else is involved in that? How much is it tracked on behavior as opposed to people, what they say and what they do? That's what I'm like, why I'm interested. But the thing what do they then adopt and change, and what do they dismiss as a consequence? Like, and are they adopting and changing and dismissing the right things, or are they not? And how can you try and influence? That's the bit that from within this I would want to maybe try and pick out a bit more with what's going on. That's the hard thing, obviously, with all of this, is that by trying to produce something that's useful and relevant to everybody, it becomes so broad that also it reduces its relevance to people as well. Like, that's one of the big challenges in this space. But that would be one of the things I'd want to pick up from that.
And then the last step in our journey is this idea of purposeful trust, and this idea of regenerative comms, that we don't just go out there to earn confidence to influence, but also replenish and enhance the ecosystem, the wider social fabric. And I just wonder about the significance of this, in that if we're to be a more purposeful society, a less polarized one, we've critically got to embrace the idea that we've not just got to take but give and grow. And just any thoughts there, Ali?
Yeah, so I think there are some times when it's absolutely right to undermine the trust in something. You know, let's take an example. When I worked for Which, we ran a big campaign against Volkswagen because they had been lying about vehicle emissions, you know, and we were absolutely right to point that out and to undermine trust in them as a consequence. Like, that's it. That's important that there's consequence. So there are times when that's really important as a scrutiny function, but that as a general rule, you need to be a bit more careful. The way I often frame this when I'm talking to comms people or to campaigners or people trying to bring about change, and sometimes they'll do that through division, as I say, that's perfectly okay at points. But when you do a campaign, you don't finish when you win it or when you get to the end of the project. You actually really finish it once you get to a point where you've persuaded enough people of something that it's unlikely to be undone. So let's look at abortion in the US out here. Like, there's been a very, very long campaign since the 70s to undermine trust in, you know, the pro-choice movement and the statistics behind it and all of that kind of thing. Even though they had a very seminal victory with Roe v. Wade, the very famous court case, if actually people had said, well, we haven't won yet, you know, even though we feel like we have and people have got these rights, we've won when we've got to a point where it's not going to be undone. And we've kept going, and it's not really a partisan issue in any way, or we've not let it become a partisan issue. That can be really very powerful as a way to try and deliver sustained change. And I think that's often the way that I think about this, which I find resonates with people.
And then lastly, really, sort of any final thoughts about what we're doing here. And I can really recommend your book, Poles Apart, as a great read for investing in this massive issue of tackling polarization. Any sort of overall thought before we go before we leave, Ali?
So I suppose a few things for people to think about within comms and marketing that actually there's a lot of techniques that we use that help simplify and process and explain. By simplifying comms, you can often draw on things that can make polarization more challenging. So I give a really good example now, which is, we've probably all done segmentation where we've grouped people together as types of interest and been like, held in wonder as people have been like, oh, someone lives in this kind of house, this will be how they vote, and as a consequence this will be the kind of opinions that they have, and they'll hold certain views on things that might be very triggering to us around, I know, abortion or faith and religion or all sorts of things, immigration. And when you start to group people together like that into these segments, you actually reduce accuracy, and that can be a really big, is that reinforcing polarization, even though it's a tremendously useful thing? And that's about when I talk about clearing up the mess that you might have left behind, is how can you unwind some of that? How can you show that not everybody is necessarily in that place, and those shortcuts that you end up encouraging your brain to take as a consequence, which can be very helpful for comms and marketing, are actually not always all that helpful for wider society. And what can be done there is, I think, something that the advertising and comms industry should be thinking about a great deal.
Ali, thank you so much, and good luck with all your efforts in addressing this issue of how we're poles apart. So thank you so much. That's all right.
Thank you. It's wonderful to have fellow travellers.
Take care now.
Cheers. Bye.